What's going on, you 3D modeling beasts? This is JL Mussi, and welcome to part 2 of creating stylized environmental art using Maya, Zbrush, and Substance Painter. This video is part 2 of a series that is sponsored by Autodesk. In this video, I will break down my entire stylized environmental art workflow for creating a blockout in Maya. If you've missed the first part of the series, you can click right here to catch up. In this video, I give you a proper introduction to the series so you know exactly what to expect moving forward. If you want access to all the project files, you can click the link right here. It's going to pop up on the video. And there's also a link in the description down below with instructions how to get those files. If you get some value out of this video, I would really appreciate it if you could smash that like button. Also, make sure to stick all the way to the end of the video where I show you a new workflow, how to select all your hard edges in your model with just one click. Without further ado, let's get on with the video. You'll see me begin by placing my blueprint within the background and also putting it within a different display layer. That way I can set the layer mode to R for reference. That way it's no longer selectable in the background. Throughout the blockout process, I use primarily primitives, and a lot of times I just jam them together. Not really too worried about edge flow or topology at this point. That's something that I like to clean up towards the back end of the blockout process. Right now, I'm just figuring out overall shapes and volumes. One thing you'll notice about most of the primitives that I'm creating, I actually have a symmetry line right down the middle. I achieved this primarily two ways. One is just adding more divisions when I initially create that primitive, or alternatively, with the multi-cut tool, you can hold down Control middle mouse click, and that's gonna add a edge loop right in the middle of your shape. Having this symmetry line right down the middle helps me achieve two things. One, it helps me center smaller objects around these larger primitives. And secondly, it allows me to have a vert to snap in the middle of that shape. Even if it's offset in world space, I can use the mirror function and have it set to object. That way, I can get a perfectly symmetrical object, even though it's not perfectly on world space. At this point of the process, I'm capturing the main volumes. I will add some bevels, but the bevels that I add are actually not to break up fine edges, but to help me model larger curvature within an object. Something that I like to implement right away is the use of mirroring with instances. And that is a newer feature that Maya has implemented into the mirror options, where you could actually mirror with an instance, and that way you can work on half of the model and it's going to be automatically updated on the other side. The other thing you'll also see me do is try to clean up my topology just slightly. And what I mean by this is that I'm actually trying to get rid of any n-gons. Towards the end of the blockout process, I do a overall check. But if there are obvious n-gons, especially anytime that you create a bevel, like in this example, then that's something that you might want to clean up before sending over into Zbrush. If you've ever sent an object into Zbrush with a lot of n-gons, what typically tends to happen is it's going to cause issues. And unless you triangulate your mesh, which really doesn't give you a lot of control, you're going to have possibly some faces missing and errors in your mesh. Something you'll see me do here is that if I have a shape that's going to be spread out my scene quite a bit, instead of creating a static copy, what I like to do is use the duplicate special option, set this to instance. What that's essentially going to do is all those instances are actually going to follow that parent piece. That way you don't have to create these static copies where you're continuously deleting, duplicating, and then shifting and having to reestablish that position. For this small bracket piece, what you'll see me do is actually exploit symmetry as much as possible. And what I mean by that is that I like to essentially start with a fourth, and then from that fourth, I'll clean up my topology, make sure that fourth is properly constructed. Then I can mirror that into a half, and then from that half, I'll go ahead and switch over to the other side. And you see that these symmetry lines right down the middle that I talked about earlier really help me mirror things within object mode. something you'll see me do in this part of the video is actually create a duplicate of my current bench and also create a very, very elementary rig. What this is going to allow me to do is actually test my bench in the final position that I want. And sometimes when you're actually creating something in a neutral position and you're moving it, you want to have a good idea of how all these things are actually going to fit and work together once it's in its final pose. And for that very reason, I'm actually just creating very basic groups, changing the pivot. And what that's allowing me to do is quickly create this test pose to make sure everything's fleshed out properly. The other thing that you will see me do here is create a parent-child relationship between the backrest and actually the seat. And what it allows me to do is basically select that backrest, be able to move that backrest, and the seat will follow. But then if I want to, I can move that seat independently. And that's really just helping me create this basic rig as far as a test pose. Ultimately, when you create a parent-child relationship, you get something extremely powerful, a omnipotent force. And you know what that is?
Family.
Once I have established the pose, you'll see that I have a little bit of an overlap between the bottom of that backrest and then the back of that seat. And this is something that I have to address. So once I know that this is an issue, what I can do is basically create another instance of this. And once I have an instance created, I can actually match the transformations. And now essentially what I have is a live link between the neutral pieces and also the pieces that are now posed. And with this live link via the instance, I can go ahead and correct any shapes to make sure that they properly fit once this is actually placed in a upright position. After establishing that this neutral pose is gonna work once I actually put it into pose, my next step is that I'll start taking all these cubes that have been jammed together and I'll start finalizing some of these pieces. The method that I'm applying here is basically I'm using booleans, but the trick to getting booleans to work properly is doing a little bit of pre-planning before you actually join all these pieces. When you boolean geometry, basically it's going to break all your quads, and breaking those quads is going to take the ability to add any edge loops easily into the mix. So what I like to do is having these pieces essentially overlaid on top of each other. I know exactly where these cut lines need to go in order to clean up this geometry after the boolean process. So you'll note that this cleanup process after the booleans is actually pretty simple once you establish that initial topology before you actually create the booleans. Something you'll note here is that a lot of times I'll strip away the thickness from an object if it's applicable, like in this case, where I really don't need thickness in order to step back and clean up the process. So a lot of times having that thickness in the Z can actually multiply your modeling work. So when I have a proper opportunity, I like to strip that thickness off, essentially clean up one plane, and then extrude it back towards the end of the modeling phase. For this rack piece, you'll see me that I basically started from the base of the bench since they share a lot of the basic proportions. Then there's really no need to remodel this piece from scratch, especially that base, since I already have it in the bench. Something else that I'm keeping in mind is basically the adjustments that I'm gonna have to do. And that's why I'm splitting the top part of the rack and the bottom into two pieces. That way I could actually adjust the top piece and be able to essentially adjust the height of that bar. Now that I have the bench and the rack created, I'm gonna move on to the smaller pieces. This is typically how I prefer to work, where I'll focus my attention first on the more complex parts of the project, and then I go ahead and move into the smaller, simpler props within a scene. Here, I'm starting off with the plate. I'm matching it up with that side of reference. That side of reference has been key throughout this whole modeling process to really just dial down the overall proportions rather quickly. With this cylinder, I'm starting with about 48 divisions. Depending on the pipeline that you're using and the specific requirements for your model, curved areas are usually where a lot of polygons have to be allocated in order to capture that curvature correctly. And this is why I said this is going to be low polyish. because I'm treating this as a personal piece. So I rather put the extra polygons to have a smoother mesh, something that I can get in a little bit closer with the camera without having a lot of visible faceting. However, if you have more stringent polygon requirements within your production, this is an area where you might have to go ahead and dial these cylindrical shapes down a little bit as far as density. I actually did lower the poly count quite a bit just by changing those tubes within the bench from a cylindrical base to a square base. So some of the design choices that you make within the production, especially if you opt to use flatter surfaces instead of rounder surfaces, could definitely save you a lot of polygons. Right now I'm creating this text with the type tool in Maya. The type tool has come a long ways from the early days in Maya, so it's a lot more stable and it produces a lot cleaner results than the old versions you used to. And ultimately what I'm doing here is applying a bend deformer to bend the text into shape. You'll notice in the base plate that I added some extra edge loops. These edge loops are acting as guides, and these guides are helping me to get the perfect spacing between all this text. Something else to keep in mind, and I did mention this earlier, but anytime that you have a large number of n-gons and you're planning to send this over to ZBrush, this is something that you want to address. On this text here, you'll see me apply the remesh, which is basically just gonna condense all these big n-gons into all triangles. You can alternatively use the triangulate feature within Maya to give you a similar result. However, I do think that the remesh does a better job at basically reducing the overall poly count down. Right now, all this text is going to introduce quite a bit of geometry. I'm not going to worry about it right now. I'm thinking more about it as the high poly, as having a base for the high poly where I can sculpt. And then once I have that high poly created, then I really think about reducing this enough. And if I can't reduce it enough optimally, I'll probably see if I can just normal map the information on the flat face of this plate. You also see me create this very simple bar. Anytime that you create something that is meant to be bent, you will have to apply additional geometry. This is something that I do quite a bit with the connect tool, where you can select pretty much all your rings, and within the modeling toolkit you have a connect tool that for all the rings selected you could just basically subdivide very easily using that tool. And then once everything's subdivided, again I will use that bend deformer to give the bar just a slight bend. Now that I have the bulk of the props blocked out, I move on to what I call the stylization phase of the blockout, where essentially I start adding a squash and stretch feel to most of the props. That way they go from a more realistic look to a more of a stylized look. And these are the design elements that we spoke about earlier. A great way of doing this is using the lattice deformer. The lattice deformer makes pretty much adding stylization to any model relatively easily. You'll notice that on the bench padding, I did add quite a bit more divisions than I initially started. And that's because I actually want some curvature when I start deforming this into a stylized look. So once I added more of the divisions, I can go ahead and slap on a lattice. The key to getting the lattice to work properly is find that sweet spot of not using too many divisions. This is where a lot of beginners get the lattice wrong, is that they'll start with a 10 by 20 by 30, and they'll have a super dense lattice. The more points that you have in the lattice, the more irregular that shape is going to be. Think about this when you're working in a package like Illustrator, where you want to find that balance of enough points in that curve, and adding too many points is going to take away from the smoothness of that curve. Another great tool to getting this stylized look to work flawlessly, in addition to the lattice, is using the lattice in combination with the soft select tool. Combining both of these tools will really allow you to control the fall off and the curvature of your stylized model. At this point, I'm going through all of my model and I'm really looking at that style sheet to help me make those design choices to really give this a great stylized look. Now that I applied the stylized look to most of the model, I will go ahead and create some additional props here. I'm going to create a curl bar and also the dumbbells. With the curl bar, I actually opted to just use a cube, extrude that cube, and pretty much get the base shape. And then from this cube, you could actually use a variety of methods. One of the methods that you could use is actually just add more topology and use the edit edge flow to basically get that curvature. And from that cube, you could basically revert back to a cylinder. I find that using cubes a lot of times is a little bit easier than using cylinders, especially when rotating these shapes around. However, with the edit edge flow, it can be finicky to find the correct number. So what I usually do is I'll get a cylindrical cap and kind of snap it towards the end of that shape. And what this allows me to do is really fine tune the correct number for the edit edge flow to get a perfect round surface. For the dumbbell itself, this was a relatively easy shape. I just started with a 6-sided cylinder and then basically added some bevels to help flesh out the shape. Now that I blocked out every single shape, everything has the stylized deformations that I wanted to give it. One of the last parts that I do within the blockout is apply bevels. So to me, it's very important that you actually delete the history before applying these bevels. That's because you don't want to have to go back and tweak bevels and actually hunt them down in a very long history stack. And this is something that I like doing quite a bit, especially if there are parts in the pipeline where I want history that I might want to be able to delete. I don't want to be actually going through a long history stack. And when you deal with more history, you're exponentially increasing the chances that your mesh could blow up or you could have an issue. So I clear out all the history, and now I have a fresh history stack to come back to, and I could modify that bevel, whether to increase it, decrease it, or actually select the bevel node altogether and delete it. Selecting hard edges manually can be very, very time consuming. Something that I like to use is selection constraints. These are the settings that I use, which is basically from 40 to about 150. That gives me about the optimal range to be able to select all of my model and not have to sift through and select all the hard edges. However, this is not bulletproof. So when you do use selection constraints, sometimes you might have to select or deselect a couple of edges, but overall using selection constraints really speeds up your workflow, especially when looking to add bevels to your hard edges. The last part of the process here that I'm doing is starting to group everything and assigning a _low suffix. And then once I actually do that, then I can go ahead and duplicate this and create my _high suffix. In order to create our correct bakes within Substance Painter between the low poly and the high poly, we're gonna need this naming convention. And setting this up in the beginning of the pipeline can actually save us a lot of problems and a lot of time from going back and forth between Zbrush and Maya and having to rename things. What I normally use is the rename tool. A great little hack here to add a naming convention to the very back instead of actually having to have a name to replace in the first place. For example, right now we're trying to put a _low, but there's nothing really to replace. So what we can do is actually put a $ in the beginning of that equation. And then the next part is we put _low. So $ is going to allow us to basically put the _low at the very end of every single one of our objects. And then once we have that _low or our low poly naming convention set, we can duplicate that group and then search and replace for the low and replace that with the high. That is pretty much it for my entire workflow. Now it's just a matter of selecting all the groups that have the _high suffix, export these as a FBX, and take this FBX into ZBrush to start my final high poly sculpt. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Creating Stylized Environmental Art with Maya, ZBrush, and Substance Painter. This series is sponsored by Autodesk. If you enjoy the content and I brought any value to you, make sure to smash that like button. If you're interested in learning stylized environmental art, 3D modeling, digital sculpting, or texturing in general, don't hesitate to hit the subscribe button. I would love to hear your feedback in the comment section down below. and whether you want me to continue making stylized tutorials like the one I just created. I would also love to hear any cool tricks, strategies, or workflows that you guys have for creating your own stylized art. That's all the time that I have for you. Make sure to check out part 3, where I take this block out into Zbrush to start creating my high poly sculpting. Until we meet again, folks, I will catch you next time.